Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RetroGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing naming and PR of different technology products. This has been something that's been on my mind for some time now, but I was spurred to do the video by a Twitter thread that was started by YCry over at videocards.com. One of the reasons that I started this channel, other than my love of technology, is that I hope to help others have an idea of what they want to buy, where their hard-earned money goes, what products that they should perhaps be interested in. But I suspect that most of you watching this channel have a higher knowledge of technology than, let's say, the average person. Now, obviously, there is only a certain amount of time in a day. You can't expect someone to know everything about every single subject, so for many people, they don't have as much time as some of us, or as much interest in some of us, to research what the best GPU is, or what the best CPU is. Instead, they probably will have a quick look at forums, or maybe some buyer's guides, and kind of figure out, hey, I've got this budget, and I want to buy this particular product. But there are certainly a lot of confusing naming schemes out there. So I want to discuss that in this very video, and I do want to hear your feedback in the comments. This video is also primarily going to focus on AMD, Intel and Nvidia, and yes, I will be giving examples of each company in alphabetical order. There are a number of different examples we could start giving with peripheral manufacturers, monitor manufacturers, SSDs, and, well, motherboard. We could just go on and on and on. But honestly, I want to limit the scope of this video so that we don't start going insane. So I figure focusing on CPUs, GPUs, and, well, APUs as well is probably a good start. This is also not to throw shade at the products themselves. Many of the products I'm going to mention, for example, the RX 580, is an amazing product, and if it fits your budget, I am going to recommend that you purchase it. But that isn't to say that I like everything about it, specifically the naming scheme in this particular instance. The RX 500 series is essentially a refresh of the RX 400 series. In my hand here is an RX 480 that I held back in launch, and slightly off topic, it's still pretty amazing how good this card is despite its age. The 500 series is also based on Polaris, just like the 400 series, albeit with slightly tweaked specifications. Taking the RX 580 as an example, we have 1257 MHz and 1340 MHz for the base and boost clock frequencies of the core respectively, versus 1120 and 1266 MHz. The memory configuration is identical, so 256-bit memory interface, 8GB of memory, well, 4 and 8GB of memory, and that means, of course, you have identical memory bandwidth. You can basically say that the RX 580 is the 480, but someone's just gone into Afterburner or whatever overclocking application and raised the core clock frequency. It's essentially identical. That is, if you are referring to the RX 580 without 2048 added to the name. This is actually an RX 570, which has 2048 shaders. So AMD here have rebadged, renamed, whatever you want to call it, an RX 570 as an RX 580, but so that they are honest, they added 2048 to denote the number of shaders. To AMD's credit, they were honest on the cut in shaders by adding it to the name, although if you are not super technically inclined and you don't know this stuff, you could easily have bought a 580 2048, which the name is not even easy to say, and figured that you got the same performance as your friend who just bought the regular plain old RX 580. I will also say to AMD's credit that they did only release the GPU, to my knowledge anyway, in China and the Asian markets, but still, they also deserve to have the best product, so I'm not a massive fan of that naming scheme. The RX 570, however, to AMD's credit, is a little more tweaked compared to the RX 580. So the 570 did have not only faster memory clock frequencies, but also faster core clocks. So they didn't just raise the core frequencies with the 570, they also raised the memory frequencies as well, which did increase memory bandwidth a little bit, which is obviously definitely a good thing. I actually have very few issues with the Ryzen lineup of CPUs and the naming scheme outside of the APUs, which I'll get to in just a moment. But let's say the Ryzen 7 3700, the Ryzen 9 3900X, all of that makes sense, and it's pretty easy to ascertain that, let's say, the 3600 is going to be a lower performing processor than, let's say, the 3700, and the 3700 likewise is going to be a lower performance CPU than the 3900, and so on and so on. The only CPU that kind of makes me raise my eyebrows there is the 3800X. I think it was a bit superfluous to add it, and it felt kind of more like AMD are padding their lineup a little bit, but I don't have any particular issue with them doing that. And also Threadripper, the second generation, also makes a lot of sense as well, like the 2990WX and other things. They just kind of make sense in terms of logically you go up the SKU number and the performance goes up likewise. The APUs, however, I'm not such a big fan of. Once again, I'm not calling these products bad. For example, the Ryzen 7 3780U, which is found in the new Microsoft Surface line, actually is pretty impressive and scores really well in 3D Mark, and for a 15-watt TDP, it's a very impressive CPU. 4 cores, 8 threads, and has a base and boost frequency of 2.3 to 4 GHz, which is pretty darn nice, and also an RX Vega 11, which has 11 compute units. What I don't like, however, is the name 3000, because I suspect some people are going to get confused and think that it belongs to the Zen 2 lineup. So obviously this is based on the 12nm Zen Plus architecture instead, and also does not have an RDNA based GPU. Instead, it is based upon the Vega architecture. In this particular model, it contains 11 compute units because it is the RX Vega 11 and runs at 1.4 GHz. Next up is Intel, and its product lineup ranges from simple to understand to extremely convoluted. By far, though, the weirdest thing going on with Intel's product line is the 10th generation, specifically on the mobility side of things, where we have not just Comet Lake CPUs, but also Ice Lake. And, well... So, I'm going to play a game with you, and then I'll reveal the answer. Which of these is Ice Lake, and which of these is Comet Lake? This is for mobility. So, i7 1068G7, and the next product is 10710U. I'm going to give you a moment. Okay, so the last one I read out is Comet Lake, and the first one I read out is Ice Lake. But both of those do belong to the 10th generation. So how you can tell these apart, if you couldn't guess, which I don't blame you for not having a crystal ball with you, is that Ice Lake parts end with the GPU type. So you can basically tell this because it has a G7 at the end, and Comet Lake ends with the series, so in this case it was OU. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Easy to remember. No one's ever going to forget that. It just makes perfectly easy and not confusing for anyone ever. Their naming scheme is so confusing that I've even seen official Intel accounts, so social media accounts just to clarify, actually get confused with the naming scheme. It's just absolutely crazy that they decided to do this in PR, and I really hope that this is resolved for future CPUs, and I also hope this does not spread to the GPUs as well. This is going to be even weirder when, of course, Comet Lake finally launches for desktop. Just as a quick reminder, Comet Lake is based based, on the Skylake architecture, but we shall see an increased number of cores. The rumours have the highest end SKU featuring up to 10 cores, so that would be 20 threads, whereas the 9900K features just 8 cores, 16 threads. So that's going to be kind of weird, because that means we're going to get this bifurcation, this split between what's available on the desktop in terms of architecture as well as what's available for the mobile parts. But that's of course because of the 10nm issues that Intel have also been kind of dealing with. Intel's HEGT lineup for this generation was also a bit weird, with the i9-9980XE, essentially the same CPU as the 7980XE, albeit with a few differences here or there. The 9 series had a slightly modified cache layout compared to the 7 series, and also a little bit of playing around with the frequencies as well. Just like AMD, I could find many other examples from Intel's lineup, but I don't want this video to be like 45 minutes, so let's jump over to Nvidia, and oh god. Yeah, Nvidia's lineup probably is actually more confusing than Intel or AMD's, and I'm probably even going to say combined. So one really clear example was back in the days with the Titan. Do you remember when they released the Titan X, and then they released another Titan X, and then a bit later on people started to call the second Titan X the Titan XP, because it at least made some sense for us to be like, okay, well, you mean the older Titan when you say Titan X, and Titan XP is the new one. And then Nvidia then decided to release the Titan XP. I don't know what they were thinking there, but okay. The GTX 1060 3GB, which had, well, 3GB of memory, 192-bit bus. The memory clock frequency was 2002 MHz because of, well, you know, DDR5 and all. And it contained 1152 CUDA cores. So, okay, pretty easy to understand, right? Well, no, because then there was also the GTX 1060 6GB 9GBps model, which was launched a little later on. This particular card contained 1280 CUDA cores, and also had a memory clock bump as well to 2257, and still contained 192-bit bus though, and 6GB of memory. Yeah. Many give Nvidia flack for the GTX 60 naming scheme, and honestly, I don't mind that too much. I don't think it sounds very cool, but that's from a personal perspective. But to Nvidia's credit, at least they are trying to make it obvious that this line does not have features like ray tracing, whereas this line does have features such as ray tracing. So to Nvidia's credit, I do like the fact that they've called it the GTX 16 series and RTX 20 series. It's very obvious that this lineup has ray tracing, whereas this lineup doesn't have ray tracing. There's also, of course, the super naming convention. Nvidia more recently have launched the RTX 2070, RTX 2060, and finally RTX 2080 Super, and they've pinky sworn that they're not going to release the RTX 2080 Ti Super, if only to not make us insane by repeating the name. So the RTX 2070 Super, for example, has almost the same level of performance as the vanilla RTX 2080. I don't necessarily have an issue with Nvidia launching the Super series. It, to me, sounds kind of like a refresh, and to their credit, they could have released it as the RTX 30 series, so I'm glad they didn't do that. But I don't particularly like the Super name, and I think some people are getting confused of what the heck's the difference between the RTX 20 whatever Super versus what's the difference between a Super and a Ti. And it's even getting worse now that the 16 series reportedly are going to have Ti's as well as Supers. This gets even worse when some companies have GPU lines that have been established for some time now, like EVGA, and they're super clocked at series. So to me, I don't really like the super naming convention. It could have been worse, to be totally honest, but I also am not a big fan of it. Prior to doing this video, I decided to do some Googling and typed derivatives of the search term, company name, confusing naming scheme, or confusing product line, and so on and so on. And it was very interesting, the sheer number of results that I received. And you can argue that, of course, people are more likely to discuss things if it bothers them, and you have a fair point there. But even looking at websites like, I believe it was GameDebate.com, were running polls on whether people were finding the GTX 16 series naming scheme confusing. And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes, people did. Now, of course, there needs to be multiple product SKUs across different price points. Not everyone can afford a GPU which is, let's say, $1,000 US, and if you can, you're extremely fortunate. So there needs to be products that are like $500, $300, $150, and so on and so on. I just find it a little frustrating that we do get products like the RX 580 2048, and Nvidia are consistently adding to the naming scheme confusion with their lineup, with the GTX 16 series now coming out with super cards, and it's just so crazy. And I realize that many of you who are watching this are pretty technical. You probably do understand the difference between this line of cards and this line of cards, and that's great. But the fact is, not everyone has that amount of time to do that amount of research, and I just wish that things were just a little bit simpler and made a little bit more logical sense. With that all said though, I'd love to hear your feedback on this. What do you think of the current naming schemes from all three different manufacturers? And for that matter as well, motherboards, monitors, give your feedback on all of that. Tell me what you think the most egregious naming schemes are, and we can start discussing that. With all of that said, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day, bye for now.